This program is a presentation of University of California Television. Your support makes UCTV's programming possible. Contribute online at uctv.tv/support. Check out our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
I'm so pleased to see such a large turnout for today's event, which is part of the 15th anniversary of the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Endowed Symposium in Jewish Studies here at UCSB. 15 years and running. My name is Leonard Wallach. I am the program coordinator for this enterprise, and I want to say how delighted we are to have you all, and what a special occasion it is for all of us, for the reason that today our report from Jerusalem will be delivered by two prominent Middle East experts, David Makovsky, who's the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Project on Middle East Peace Process at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is, of course, in Washington, D.C., and Raith Alamari, his colleague, the Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine. The two of them came here in the fall of 2009 to help us inaugurate a series of what have now become nationwide dialogues begun on this campus. And it's an emotional reunion for us all in the sense that not only are they back to see the progress of their good works, but indeed to begin some new initiatives that involve innovative models for learning that are aimed at promoting dialogue among Jews, Muslims, Christians, all over issues of the Middle East. So today you have an extraordinary treat in store. This week they've fulfilled the requirements of a very rigorous 3-day residency in which they not only co-taught a course on Jerusalem with my colleague, Professor Richard Hecht in the Department of Religious Studies, which broke Jerusalem down into about 7 communities and allowed the students to look at Jerusalem's future from the perspective of each of those communities. They also engaged in a discussion of campus activism as part of our dialogue series that looked at the divisive effects that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is having on U.S. campuses, and also ameliorative measures that we may take to improve group relations. And finally, and I think most importantly for this visit, they engaged in what I've been calling student peace negotiations, where members of various campus groups assume positions vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict opposite from the ones they normally take. And watching this process over the last 3 days has been a fascinating and extraordinary enterprise, and one that's left us all feeling a great sense of hope for the future. It's now my pleasure to welcome the program chair of the Taubman Symposia, Professor Richard Hecht.
Thank you very much, and I'm in an unusual position. Usually I'm at the podium, right? For those of you who have seen me do this before. But this is an unusual event. As Leonard pointed out to you, Raith Alamari and David Makovsky have been working very hard, teaching us a whole series of things. Some of you who may be my age may remember the very famous African-American singer, James Brown. Anyone remember him? No? Yes? James Brown. You remember how he'd always start one of his shows. He'd say, you know, he would sing, "Baby, Please Don't Go," and that would be followed by "Night Train." And the famous Flames who were with him would say that he's the hardest working man in show business. David Makovsky and Raith Alamari can outdo them. They must be two of the hardest working teachers that I've ever seen. Literally, they've been working with our students from early in the morning until relatively late in the evening. And as Leonard pointed out to you, I've been teaching a course with a number of students on Jerusalem. And the project that we set out for ourselves is to try to figure out possible ways to solve the question of Jerusalem. And to do that, we've had the extraordinary perspective of my colleagues first, and I'm going to ask them to come out. First, David Makovsky, if you could come out, please. Right here? Yes. And then secondly, Rafe Alamari, to sit on that side. Now, Leonard has introduced their distinguished credentials to be here. And each of you have the program booklet which summarizes it, and I will not go over that, except to add to what you have in front of you the following statement that these guys are excellent teachers. And beyond that, however, I think that their friendship for one another doesn't mean they don't have very sharp disagreements. Their friendship with one another becomes a model for all of us for the possibility of our shared futures as Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Now, in order to facilitate this, I asked 5 students to join us who have been working with us, and they are prepared to ask questions. So I'd like to invite them out individually. First, I'd like to have Omer Harari, who is a senior in sociology. Omer, will you come out and take a seat here? And then next, Nadim Hussein, who is a senior in my department and in Global and International Studies. Nadim, will you join us? Next, Jessica Triol, who is a senior in political science. Jessica, will you join us? Next, Cyrus Moshiri, who is a junior in global and international studies. Cyrus, you want to join us? And then finally, Avi Rubin, who is a senior in global studies, global and international studies. And we're going to have a discussion in the group here, and at about, oh, sorry, Avi. We're going to have a discussion, and at about 5:30, I will ask our ushers to distribute cards to you that each of you can write a question. And those cards will be delivered to me, and I will try to select the best questions on those cards and to read them so that we can all, in a sense, participate with Rafe and David. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask our guests, Rafe and David, to respond to what we've learned about Jerusalem and the possibilities of solving the Jerusalem problem in this enormously long conflict.
Thank you, Richard. And first of all, thank you all. Every time that I come to one of these events and I see so many people turn out, I'm actually encouraged. This is a conflict that if you watch the news, you would think this is intractable, this is unsolvable. Yet, over and over again, we see people turn out and we see great interest because ultimately, the symbolism, the human dimension, as well as the national security interest that we have in this country, means that this conflict, no matter how difficult it is, it has to be solved. So I'm very encouraged when I see this turnout. And it's also a very emotional event for me personally, and I think for David for coming here. This is, as I think Richard and Leonard said, was the first time that we've done this kind of activity together. We have been colleagues for a long time, interacted in the Washington policy world, but this was the first of now dozens of these events, and I must say it was the birth of a friendship. A friendship that's based obviously on personal chemistry and respect, but also based on the fact that even though we come at it from different places, even though we come at it from different areas of interest, we have a common objective. We want a two-state solution that gives dignity to the Israelis and to the Palestinians. And based on that, we look at our differences as obstacles to be overcome through partnerships, not through alibis for inaction. So it's a friendship that owes a large part of it to actually this campus and this particular hall. In terms of Jerusalem, what is the solution to Jerusalem? I think there are two components to this question. One component is, what does the solution look like? What does a final status agreement, a peace agreement on Jerusalem look like? That's the first question that I will try to address. But a second question, which is not less important, is the question of what is the timing? Is it something that can be resolved now? Is it something that we need to defer? Is the time ripe for that? And I think David might want to respond to this. In terms of what the substance of a solution for Jerusalem, I think the fundamental point to say here is that when you look for a solution, you will look for something that will not meet each other's maximal expectations, but will meet enough of their interests and enough of their expectations to be palatable, to be sellable to either side. It has to be a solution that at the end of the day, the Palestinian president, the Israeli prime minister will go to their publics and have a victory speech. No side can go and say, I give up on Jerusalem. Both have to have enough. Now, Jerusalem, like the rest of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is probably one of the most overstudied topics in the world. And so we know, by and large, what a solution that creates this balance between two sides' interests and concerns looks like. And the solution was really laid out by President Clinton back in 2000 and was then expanded through many books written and initiatives created. And it looks like the following. Jerusalem, for those of you who know it, is not one thing. Jerusalem is many things. The first component of Jerusalem is it's a city. Like many other cities, it's an urban environment. People live there. Sadly, but conveniently for policy purposes, Jerusalem is a very segregated city, is Jerusalem. Arabs and Palestinians live in certain neighborhoods. Israelis, Jews live in other neighborhoods. The two do not really mix together. And so the solution to the urban landscape of Jerusalem is through division. What is Jewish today? The Jewish neighborhoods will become part of Israel. The Palestinian neighborhoods will become part of Palestine. So you have two capitals for two states in the city that will be, unfortunately, but by necessity, divided. This is not very complicated, because many of these urban areas do not have great symbolic, historic, or religious significance to either communities. Which brings us to the second part of Jerusalem, which is what we called technically, we call it the Holy Basin. This is the part of Jerusalem which is so dense with history, culture, religion. This is the old city. This is the cemetery on the mountain. This is the city of David. These are these areas where every inch has been walked on by multiple prophets. That appears on the posters and the propaganda material for each nation. And with this part, particularly the old city, it cannot be physically divided. For those of you who've been to the old city, if you build a wall there, you have destroyed a site of world heritage. You have destroyed sites of religious significance and national significance to millions of people. It cannot be divided. So we have to come up with a shared regime for dealing with this site. And again, it is doable. We are talking about a very small amount of land where you will have shared policing, shared municipal work, and you will have, obviously, a third party that will ensure that this shared activism actually works in reality. And finally, what you have is the holiest of them all, the most complicated site, which is the Temple Mount, known to Jews as the Temple Mount, known to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif. And the complexity of this site is that the Muslim holy site sits exactly on top of the Jewish holy site. And on this one, again, the practicality of it is not that complicated. Today, we have actually a separation of functions. Today, Muslim authorities, the Waqf, run the Muslim holy sites, and Jewish authorities under the Israeli government run the Jewish holy sites. This needs to be codified, and the concerns of both parties have been taken into account. The Israelis are concerned with two things: concerned about security that the mosque area is not used to shoot at the prayers, at those who are praying at the plaza of the Western Wall. And so we need to have very strong security arrangements with guarantees, and are concerned about the Palestinians digging in ways that will affect the Jewish holy sites, and we have to have very strict arrangements vis-a-vis excavation and renovation and what have you. And again, we are lucky that if you look at UNESCO and you look at departments of archaeology all over the world, we have clear guidelines on how to do that. The Palestinians are concerned that Israel does not dig under the foundations of the Muslim holy sites, and therefore the Israeli activities underneath will have to be monitored. So what we have is nominal control by both sides, but very, very strong external constraints to make sure that neither side hurts the major interests of the other side. I mentioned that Jerusalem will have to be divided. This is true, and this is necessary for security and economic reasons. However, the division will have to be softened because of the symbolic nature of Jerusalem. When you divide Jerusalem, you will find that many Muslim holy sites will fall on the Israeli side, and many Jewish holy sites will fall on the Palestinian side. So we also have to come up with certain regimes that will ensure that you have free access by worshippers from both nations and from both faiths, not to, of course, forget the Christian faiths that have many interests there. But within that compilation, we have a deal that, again, does not meet the aspirations of both communities, but meet enough for each leader and each politician to go to his public and say, I have gotten enough. Your Jerusalem, my Jerusalem, your faith, your beliefs are preserved in this agreement. And thank you very much.
Okay. Raith very eloquently explained how happy we are to be here. So I won't really reiterate except to thank Richard and Leonard Wallach and the teams, both of these gentlemen who brought us here. This is where it began for the two of us, and we've been taking this on the road now to dozens of campuses. And as Raith said, a very close personal friendship has emerged. But it really, we knew each other before we came to Santa Barbara in 2009, but here's where we really started working together. Our goal, frankly, is to try to bring more light and less heat to a very emotional subject. And we feel that Washington, on many things, is behind the curve, but on this one issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the campuses tend to be, in certain campuses are more inflamed, and the campuses tend to be more behind the curve, where in the policy community, it's very commonplace that the two of us will work together and trying to solve problems. That doesn't always, we don't always see that on the campuses, and that's why we're doing this, because we think we need a sense of civility and very much a solutions-based discourse. So we're happy to be back to where we started. In terms of your question, Richard, look, Raith really illuminated a lot of the points. I might quibble over a couple of issues, but it's really at the margins. My bigger fear is the timing issue, as Raith alluded to. I'm concerned that I sometimes use American football metaphors, so bear with me if you're not a football fan. Raith has become very knowledgeable in football after doing this together. I feel if we try to throw a Hail Mary pass, a long, desperate pass, we're going to throw an interception or an incomplete pass. I would rather see us throw a screen pass, that's a short pass, for those of you who don't follow football, and run the ball 70 yards. Doesn't mean we've scored. If we are on our own goal line, we'll still be 30 yards out. But we have a better chance by throwing a short pass and running with it than we do throwing the long pass. The reason is because in the Middle East, whenever it's all or nothing, it's always nothing. That's what we know. We've been at this for a while. And there's a lot of traumas on both sides. And Jerusalem elicits a lot of this because it cuts to the self-definition of the parties, a lot like the refugee issue too, I may add. And I see pairing those two issues, bracketing them for now, because I feel that these two narrative issues, highly symbolic, cutting to the self-definition of the parties, relating to issues like religion and nationalism, are so deeply connected to these people's identity that they cannot solve it all in one go. If there was not a fact that Jerusalem was a battlefield just a few years ago with suicide bombs going off in buses and pizzerias and discos, I might think differently. And the Palestinians have their trauma as well from that violence, as well as the Israelis do. And my fear is that we need to get more people on side to be part of the solution than part of the problem. And that the religious leadership, unfortunately, there are exceptions, by the way, and, but for the most part, the religious leadership on both sides have not viewed a facilitation of a compromise in Jerusalem as really the noble ideal of both religions. And this is a problem. And so my fear is we shouldn't throw the Hail Mary. We should try to focus on borders and security first and make sure there's enough of an investment, a human investment on both sides in a two-state solution. Defer these two issues of the narrative issues, Jerusalem and refugees, where there's a clear trade-off between them. Israel makes the sort of compromises that Raith said on Jerusalem, and that will be a major, major concession for them. And the Palestinians do the same on the refugees and keep the focus of the refugees to the state of Palestine, where it would be unlimited. Nobody wants a single refugee to live in squalor. That should be a given. So the question is, if you defer these issues, how do you maintain the trust? How does one side know if I've deferred an issue, I haven't conceded an issue? What are the red lines that we could kind of institute? What sort of mechanism could we have to ensure that these issues are addressed? Because I don't want anyone to walk out of this room and think that I believe that you could solve the conflict without solving Jerusalem. I don't believe that. But I just want to succeed. I've seen failure in the past. I don't blame it all on the United States in the year 2000. I think, you know, the United States, we tried our best. The president tried his best, but it was up to the parties as well. But I think we can't afford to fail again. So I'd rather throw the screen pass, focus on borders and security, and get these people invested that they have a two-state solution, and then focus on phase 2 of that, which is how do we come up with creative strategies to get religious leaders on both sides to see this as an objective they share and not as something that threatens their very identity. Can we enlist Arab leaders to come to Jerusalem? Can we think creatively? I believe this is possible, and I'm sure we'll get into more of this, but my bottom line is, while I don't agree with the fundamental substantive part, I think that Jerusalem has to be, has to be divided so it could be the capital of both cities. I would like to make sure that we have kind of, lined it up well enough that when we deal with this issue, we will succeed here as well. But I don't want the all-or-nothing approach that I fear is out there due to the religious identities of the parties and due to their recent past where they feel that they've been blown up. So I want to succeed, and that's why I would like a two-step process.
The students have prepared some thoughtful questions, and I'd like to ask Nadim to ask his question and then ask Rafe and David to respond to it. Nadim?
All right. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for sharing your insight into this issue. My question is, it seems like you both support dividing Jerusalem. That seems like the most practical approach. In the case that Jerusalem is divided into an East and West Jerusalem to accommodate both a Palestinian and an Israeli capital, what would be done with the Israeli neighborhoods or settlements that would be left in East Jerusalem?
Right. I mean, here we go back to the Clinton parameters. And this is where actually Jerusalem is a unique case. Because if you look, if you zoom out a little bit, and if you look at the contours of a peace deal, any two-state solution peace deal, at the end of the day, settlements in the West Bank that are not annexed to Israel as part of a land swap will have to be evacuated by Israel. Jerusalem is very different because the assumption is that the Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem Call them neighborhoods, call them settlements, whatever you want to call them. But these neighborhoods will end up being annexed to Israel. This has been a case which was been clearly set down by President Clinton, which has been, this baseline that all future initiatives until today, whenever we go back to actually formally talking about this, this continues to be the baseline. So the idea is there will be no Jewish population concentrations that will not be under Israeli sovereignty. So in this regard, it is quite different. And I would add here, though, that, sorry, until today, if you look at the map, if you go and walk on the ground in Jerusalem, it's still doable. The two communities are still separated enough, and the two sets of neighborhoods are still separated enough that you can actually create that division. You will need to have a couple of tunnels and a couple of bridges here and there, but by and large, it's doable. I'm afraid, and this is the point that David alluded to, if there are no red lines in terms of the two sets of neighborhoods seeping into one another, new ones being created, that we will get to a point where the city is so intermeshed that this division becomes impossible, that a solution to Jerusalem becomes impossible. And in my view, if you cannot resolve Jerusalem, you will never have peace. I'm agnostic about David's approach of deferring Jerusalem. Tactically, I believe, you get to a certain moment and you make your calculation. If it's politically feasible to go for the big one, for the whole deal, you go for it. If it's not feasible, you go for a partial. But ultimately, if you do not have a solution that includes Jerusalem in the end game, the whole piece will unravel. Not only will it unravel between the two sides, but the conflict will be transformed. Today, until today, the conflict is a national political one. It has religious undertones and political and ideological undertones, but it's a national political conflict, and therefore it's resolvable. If Jerusalem collapses as a part of this solution, then the conflict transforms into a religious one. And if it's religious, what my God gave me and what your God gave you will never be reconciled. And it will no longer be a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It will draw in a much wider, less invested, and more ideological component that might make it spin out of control. So it's something that worries me. I still think it's doable, but I'm afraid that things might be accelerating in a way that in a few years, this will no longer be possible.
Okay, when I meant red lines and a mechanism, what I meant by that is there would be, first of all, there'd have to be a timetable that this issue would be addressed. It wouldn't be just left open-ended. Maybe it would take, 5 years to solve the borders and security, that the people who have become so skeptical and cynical actually see that something is moving and that we could have an impact on public opinion. And we can work with the religious leaders on both sides. But the red lines that I meant was no encroachment in Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. Israel builds in Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem that the Palestinians say are going to be Israeli, but they have to have a clear understanding that they cannot build in the Arab neighborhoods. Or else, if you defer an issue as a Palestinian, you'd feel like you've conceded the issue. And that's what we don't want. What we want is a sense that this issue is preserved enough to resolve it. And I think that while it's impractical to say everything has to freeze for a few years, what is practical is to say no building in the Arab neighborhoods. And that will maintain the credibility of this process going forward.
I'm going to ask the usher.
By the way, if I can just add one point, I'm sorry. I was very pleased that President Obama, in his speech in May 19th of this past year, took the same position. It used to be heretical to say what I said. I wrote a book with Dennis Ross. You can look at page 151 in the book, where we call for this, and Dennis became the chief Middle East advisor of President Obama. But in President Obama's speech, he said this. He said, let's solve borders and security, and let's defer Jerusalem and refugees. When he said it, I think people were stunned, but I think the president was right, and the president understood it correctly, that this had to be done sequentially.
Could I ask the ushers now to distribute cards and pencils? I think you all have, do you have cards or pencils? Oh, you do. Do you have questions? Have you written questions? Well, start writing questions and we'll come and get them shortly. I'd like to ask Omer, who is seated here on my left, who is very interested in issues of how the city is divided, and that division really prevents the kind of living together, I think, that is suggested. Omer?
So it seems to me that, like, with settlement and the wall, the security barrier, Israelis and Palestinians are living on the ground in what I like to think of as like a tense proximity. I realize this might be a broad assumption. Not all relationships are the same, but I'm trying to imagine the role of time and the mentalities of new generations being brought up under these new conditions. So essentially, what do you think will be the role of the peace process, say 20 years from now, or if agreements are reached today, like, will they still be meaningful?
Let me first of all talk a bit about the nature of agreements and move a bit then towards time. When I first joined the negotiation process, young, enthusiastic, fresh into this issue, I used to look at peacemaking as flirtation, courtship. Here we are, the Palestinians and Israelis try to build a shared future together. Fast forward a few years, and I start looking at it very differently. I look at it now as a divorce. I am afraid, and I'm concerned, that in our trying to idealize peace, we have loaded too much onto a process in a way that made it, in a ways, unresolvable. So in some ways, while this might not sound particularly, warm and human oriented, I believe that I do not care at the moment about relationship. Right now, what I care about is a separation. The Palestinians off the back of the Israelis off the back of the Palestinians. It's a divorce. You get the kids, I get the furniture. And in time, we might be friends, we might not be friends. But that's not part of the divorce settlement. Right now, let's separate, let's start to have a more normal life for both communities and let them develop organically. And then in a few years' time, we will see where it goes. I personally, as someone who sees a future for Palestine as a democratic, Western-oriented country, I would like to see strong relations with Israel as a way of a gateway towards Europe and the West. Others in my Palestinian community look at Palestine as looking more eastwards. That is a question, that is a domestic Palestinian question. It's for me and my Palestinian counterparts to resolve politically among ourselves. And that will determine how it moves. But at the end of the day, look at basic interest. Israel wants to be the homeland of the Jewish people in a secure place. Let's give them that. The Palestinians want to be a sovereign Palestinian state. Let's give them that, and let the future take care of itself.
I would say this is objectively hard because on one hand, it's about a couple getting a divorce. I accept the metaphor, but it's like getting a divorce while living in the same bedroom almost. This isn't the Egypt piece. The Egypt piece, relatively, while it was a landmark, breathtaking achievement of Anwar Sadat's visit and Menachem Begin, reaching a treaty, ultimately there was a 200-kilometer buffer in the middle of these two people called the Sinai Desert. So that was demilitarized, and the Israelis go their way, and the Palestinians go their way. So basically, they don't see each other again. The treaty as such is the end. Here, the treaty is the beginning. It is a divorce on a certain level, but there's just too much history and too little geography. And they live on top of each other virtually. And so therefore, the quality of the relations are important, I would argue, and cannot be ignored. Where I would, take a little issue with Omer's question is, I realize he asked it neutrally, is that I don't see things in the Middle East as being static. I don't think you could just put this issue in a freezer and say, oh, well, it's not ready now, but let's come back in 10 years and see what happens to the whole issue of peace. We have to keep working this because whether we're partially successful or more than partially successful, because the process of radicalization is real. The stakes are extremely high for both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. The alternative to Abbas and Fayyad, it's not the Hadassah women of Brooklyn. It's Hamas. And if you do not find a way to have converging interests, on both sides, moderates will be discredited, and there will be radicalization. And look at all the sweeping changes in the Middle East. It teaches us that security arrangements are going to have to be very tight, but it teaches us also a certain humility that that the new era of politics could be very different. It used to be you made peace with governments. And you could say, look, here you'll make peace with peoples. That's even better than making peace with Hosni Mubarak or King Hussein or King Abdullah of Jordan. But yes, but it's going to be hard. Israel's used to be dealing with governments, and the new Arab politics, I fear, could bring about much more radical groups who play off the stalemate. I see even in the Turks, the AKP party, Erdogan, the prime minister, the president, he uses this issue and exploits it for domestic political advantage. So in my view, people say, well, you know what, you don't make big decisions during a hurricane. You go to the cellar and you stay in the cellar. That's true if you think the hurricane is going to pass. But if the hurricane is constant, you can't live in a cellar. You're going to have to deal with that reality. So I think, I don't think we could just 20 years from now, oh well, we can't do it, so oh well, too bad. But that's assuming everything remains constant. I don't assume things in the Middle East remain constant. And I think if we don't do what we can, even if we can't do everything, but borders, security, something, then this cynicism will breed radicalization, and I fear that we're just going to dig fresh graves and we'll be left with old problems. So I think we have to try to do what we can do, even if we can't do everything.
Now I'd like you to pass your cards. I have the instructions now. Leonard gave them to me over my shoulder. So please pass your question cards to the center aisles, and the ushers will pick them up as we continue our discussion. I'd like to ask Jessica to pose her question to our guests.
We've been discussing the relationships of the publics and the effect that the separation would have on them, but I'd like to discuss the importance of mobilizing Israeli and Palestinian publics in the effort to achieve peace.
I mean, first of all, if I may just take an off remark here. This is the third day that we've been dealing with our new friends here. And I must say, I have been and continue to be amazed and impressed at the quality of the students you have here. There's a testament, obviously, to the students themselves, but to the professors and to the university. In terms of public opinions, I think this has been the weakest link in Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking. The leaders, by and large, have not invested in marketing peace to their publics. Often we see the exact opposite. The leaders, knowing they have to make tough decisions, try to create artificial popularity by being hardline. We sit in the negotiating room, we make concessions. How do we deal with our own discomfort? We go out and make the most hardline, uncompromising positions and statements on TV. Now, this is good. This buys you a week or two of popularity. But I fear often that the leaders, through their rhetoric, are actually creating their own trap, climbing up their own tree. And I must say, when I was in Camp David, at some moments, late at night when we finished our negotiations, I would be concerned when we go back to our public that we have not prepared for the concession that we have to make. And as such, I think it is very, very important to start today mobilizing your public opinion. And I think the leaders on both sides, again, and the politicians, once they are confronted with certain positions, certain compromises that they have made in private, they become defensive. Oh, no, that's not what I meant, that's not how I did it. And I think it's time for those who believe in peace, who advocate for peace, to stop being embarrassed about it. You need to take the offensive. You need to go to your public and to say that this is what I propose and that's why peace is good for me. Because the other side, those who are against peace, are engaged in a very active, ongoing rhetoric and propaganda to undermine peace. Now, down to earth from this. This might sound nice, but leaders, obviously, politicians always operate on short-term calculus. And until now, in political terms, hardline messaging pays. It's important for someone to come from the outside and change this cost-benefit analysis, this cost-benefit calculus. And this someone is us, the United States. We should come to the leaders and reward good messaging and attach some cost to bad messaging. We should engage in an effort to synchronize political messaging between the two sides, to ensure that one side says something positive, it's reciprocated by the other side. Start breaking this vicious cycle and make it into more of a virtuous cycle. If we do not do that, I'm afraid that when we, the technicians, agree, the politicians might be too afraid to take this deal to their public.
Because Raith and I agree, we're going to be writing an op-ed on this issue of synchronized political messaging. We think this is crucial because the publics have become so skeptical and even, as I said before, downright cynical about hope, that this means that there's really no political space for either leader to go forward. The peace camp in Israel has been decimated. The middle ground that was on the Palestinian side in the 90s also. So the question is, in a year of 2012 that we don't believe is going to be a territorial breakthrough year, let's start beginning on this. Now, why is this so crucial? Because two sets of polls tell you the whole story. One set of polls goes like this. Do you favor a two-state solution, meaning a state for Israelis, a state for the Palestinians? The numbers on the Israeli side tend to be about 60 to 70%. I think on the Palestinian side, maybe 55 to 60%. Depends on the timing. Okay, then there's always the second question. Do you think the other side wants it? That they want a two-state? Oh, no, 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 they don't want it. And that's mirror imaging that you see on both sides of the polling data, that neither believes the other one wants it. The others, they don't hear the good things that have been done by the other side. The leaders will talk to us privately and will whisper it, but they don't talk about it publicly. Now, why don't they? Because they're afraid that if they say something nice about the other side, that the other side will put it in their pocket and will say, well, if I'm doing such a good job, there should be more pressure on you to concede more. That's why we call for synchronized messaging, because we don't believe either side will do it alone. The good news is they've actually said some interesting things, but it tends to get lost, swallowed up. It's fragmented, it's not coordinated, disjointed, and it gets lost. So Netanyahu will come to the US Congress and for the first time say, I understand the Palestinians have a relationship to Jerusalem. Okay, that was a big deal. It wasn't picked up here, but it has to be repeated there. And the same thing with Abbas, has said certain things that have not been repeated, and therefore it has gotten lost. So I think the key is that this has to be synchronized, and I think this means involving religious leaders, because Jerusalem has such a dimension of the city is about religion, that the greatness of religion, of tolerance, of peace, of coexistence, this has to become more of a theme, and we have to really insist that religious coalitions are built to give us a chance. Because the reason why I'm skeptical now is I know the leaders are not conditioning the societal landscape. The chance for making it work is to get people to start doing that sort of gardening, to start cultivating the publics on both sides, and that means religious coalitions, I think, are vital in this regard.
I'd like to ask Cyrus to ask his question, which I think is a wonderful follow-up to this.
Right, yeah. So dovetailing what Jessica said, recently it seems there has been a very strong practical cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the State of Israel insofar as a security relationship goes. But we all know that the diplomatic progress has reached a deadlock. Mm-hmm. So at this point in the negotiation process, both sides know that it's going to be a two-state solution. But what more is needed to reach this common goal? And where do the major obstacles lie?
I mean, there are many answers to this question. I mean, one of them looks at constituencies for peace and how do you mobilize and create them. In the 90s, we had a very, dreamy view of the constituencies for peace. We used to think and try to build constituencies for peace around excitement, around feelings of goodwill, The problem with this is that this is easy to kind of dissipate when things get bad. What we're seeing today is a new kind of constituencies being created. Constituencies that are organized around interest as opposed to aspirations. Now, these are not mutually exclusive, but I believe that the interest-based constituencies are important and are more stable in the long term. So these are ones, you talked about, for example, the security cooperation, which has been ongoing in an unprecedented manner for the last 2.5 years. As a result, within the Israeli political and, not political, but rather ruling establishment, you have the military and the intelligence as being the strongest advocates for Palestinians. We have to start looking towards creating more of these interest-based constituencies. The second one, as I mentioned, is the issue of changing the cost-benefit calculus for the leaders. Sadly, as much as the current conflict might not be good strategically for the Palestinians and the Israelis, in pure political terms, neither the Palestinian leadership nor the Israeli leadership is under any direct political threat. There is no pain involved in inaction. And therefore, also, we have to increase the reward and in some cases attach some pain to inaction. And finally, I would say, let's be realistic. With all of this said, with anything that we can do, with the messaging, with all of this year, nothing is going to happen in the big political process. We can go into the weeds of why this is. Suffice it to say that there's going to be no American leadership. We have our own other concerns here. And therefore, without American leadership, you will have no breakthrough. Therefore, let's be humble in defining the goal. This year, we will not have a peace deal, but we can still have progress. One thing I've learned in the Middle East, if you don't move forward, you slide backwards. If there's a vacuum, someone fills the vacuum. So it becomes important to create a sense of motion. And we have the foundations for that. We have a degree of security cooperation between the two that has never existed that allows for certain measures on the ground, including expansion of Palestinian jurisdiction beyond the existing urban areas, to create a sense for the Palestinians that the occupation is being rolled out, that we are in a process that will lead us to statehood, and equally to show to the Israelis that you have partners on the Palestinian side that you can trust with these issues. These are ideas that we have been talking about for a while and are now being adopted by the International Quartet, by Tony Blair, by the US administration, but it's important to be practical, set our sights at an achievable goal, and not allow let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
To add to this, where I think we've got something going is that on the ground, this practical cooperation, there used to be a lot of terrorism coming out of the West Bank, and this cooperation, thankfully, hasn't had an impact in Gaza because the Palestinian Authority is not there. That's where Hamas is. But you've got excellent cooperation. And I think the Israelis deserve credit, and the Palestinians, Salam Fayyad, it's a whole new approach that he has put forward. I think with Yasser Arafat, we saw much more of a culture of victimization and a victimhood. And with Fayyad, it's about an ethos of accountability. It's about governance. It's about improving living standards. He's a PhD from Texas in economics. And this has gone a long way in having an impact on, as Ray said correctly, on the Israeli security establishment, the intel establishment, believing that there is a partner here that wasn't there before. And I think I can't tell you how, cannot underestimate this. It's so important. You can't overestimate its importance. I think I should say it that way. This ethos is crucial. And because as this has taken hold, Israel's been able to pare back its checkpoints that have existed in the West Bank. I talked to the 3-star general at the Pentagon whose job is every month to go and visit checkpoints. And he said, David, when I started this, there were 42 main manned major checkpoints. Now we're down to 3. So as the security situation has improved, Israel has reduced the barriers of access and movement. You've had 8–10% growth at a time of a worldwide recession, and that's not something to be sneezed at. So I think we finally have got some foundation blocks that we haven't had. It's not good to just cry wolf and say, oh, it's never been worse, it's never been worse. It's not true. Things have been better in a certain way. The question is, how do we capitalize on it? Because I'll be the first to say and to admit that a bottom-up approach that was just stated here by Cyrus, the bottom-up approach is critical, but it will not be lasting if it is not met by top-down negotiations, because the people engaged in it will be accused by their critics of trying to make occupation more efficient and not trying to solve this conflict. And there will be this discrediting on both sides. So I feel that it's critical that as successful as the bottom-up approach has been, it is met with the top-down. That's the surest way to make sure that these positive changes of governance and economic growth are enduring.
Okay, I'm going to ask now Avi to ask his question, because I think it comes back to the issue of the religious identity of Jerusalem and the role of religious leaders. Avi?
So speaking on the immense religiosity of Jerusalem itself as a city, how could any sort of separation or divorce of the city itself account for access to religious sites for all the religions, specifically the Christian religion, which has sites spread more throughout the region? And then following that same thought, how could such strong religious faith, respected all across the board, be used as an avenue to build these religious coalitions that David mentioned, and be used as some sort of cooperation and mutual understanding towards the future?
Okay, actually, I mean, on the first part, the issue of access. When I said that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is one of the most overstudied conflict issues, I was not joking. We actually have had very, very, very specific and detailed plans and maps and ideas of how, for example, a place like the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron, okay, which will be most likely under Palestinian sovereignty. We have talked about what kind of buses are going to transport Israeli pilgrims from West Jerusalem to Hebron, and what kind of security arrangements. And we've made the same kind of examinations and the same kind of studies into access between the different sides of East and West Jerusalem for people to visit their holy sites. So I talked about a separation, and a stark separation. But at the same time, you need to soften it by creating mechanisms that will start responding to the needs and to the sensitivities of the various stakeholders in Jerusalem. Part of that is the religious, and therefore you have to create access to the sites in a way that does not endanger security or sovereignty. And again, we have very clear technical ways of doing this. This will, again, not replace the fact that you have two separate cities, but soften this fact. As to religion and its role, I am of the belief, and I must be a bit extreme in this regard, is that all narrative issues, be it religion, be it history, be it identity, are not matters for negotiation. You cannot negotiate it. You cannot negotiate history. David and I will never agree on whether or not 1948 was a good year or a bad year. We come from very different views, equally on religion and what have you. So I'm not a believer that these issues have to be subject of negotiation. But I believe that these issues should be subject to a different kind of process. Negotiations are all about compromise. Negotiations are all about reaching an agreement. With these issues, I believe we have to have parallel processes, either parallel or subsequent processes, in which both sides are exposed to the beliefs and to the worldviews of the other side. Not with a view of agreeing with that, but to the view of being sensitive to what this point of view is. Personally speaking, I grew up in an environment where I was taught that anything an Israeli says about history is an evil plot by this Israeli to undermine my version of history. I thought it was coming from a place of malice. After years and hours of spending time with my Israeli counterparts, I came to understand that they say what they say because they believe it. There's a true faith, and they say it not from a place of malice, but from a place of conviction, and vice versa. And I believe that we need to have this process, but this is not best done by politicians and lawyers and diplomats. We're not skilled to do that. This should be done by people with other skill sets, people who make national identity, artists, anthropologists, historians, and get both societies to understand that there is a legitimate, even though not necessarily one that I agree of, version of the other. This is, in my view, more than security arrangements, more than anything else that in the very, very long term will stabilize peace. But it cannot be right now a component of reaching an agreement, because I think that would be overloading the process.
Well, it's because of that precise point, Avi, that I think that the Jerusalem issue is going to take time, because I think we have to build these coalitions. Right now, we don't even get the leaders in the same room, let alone solve Jerusalem. So just to get a sense of how far we have to go. And we need religious leadership, frankly, on both sides that says, you know, we're not going to solve the past. Each one's going to have their narrative, but we don't want to let the past bury the future. Now, in America, when we say, oh, well, that's history, that usually means it's over, it's done. In the Middle East, when they say it's history, that means it's alive. Just the opposite of what we mean. We use the same words, and we have 180 degrees different meaning. So we got to think about how to build these religious coalitions, educational coalitions. I'm not convinced that I know the answers always, but I think that there is a victory speech here for both sides, that each side could tell their people, that the Palestinians could say, we got a capital in East Jerusalem, and we got you know, a better control of our holy sites. And Israel, while it will be, you know, the one kind of shrinking in that regard, I think could say, but we got recognition for our Jewish neighborhoods internationally, even on East Jerusalem, that we never got before. And we got the international community excited about investing in a city that is now listed as the poorest city in the state of Israel. And I think with economic incentives, but not just economic incentives, and each side having a victory speech that they can sell, they don't have to just focus on the pain and saying it's illegitimate to yield the land because it's sacred. They could, I think, with the right encouragement, they could say, as religious leaders, we want to be a force for peace, which is the noblest aspiration of each society, and coexistence. So I don't think it's an impossibility. I just think I'm a realist that I think it's going to take time. And I'm not saying, I don't want anyone to misinterpret me, that I think that religious leaders should substitute for negotiators. No, that could lead us to absolutes very quickly. I'm talking about a supplementary, or as Raith called it, a parallel track that we enlist moderate voices on both sides. Our only hope of doing so is that the city remains quiet, frankly, like it has been since the end of 2004. With the 4 years of a volcanic eruption in the city, we have no chance. And we should know that as we pursue this peace process, rejectionists are going to be very hard at work in trying to blow it up. So it's not like we're doing this in a laboratory that's hermetically sealed. No, it's going to be hard. But I think the stakes are very high, and we have to mobilize people of all different stripes towards this goal.